Hunger, or Sult in the original Norwegian, is a fast-paced, captivating and thought-provoking novel that has went on to influence the works of Thomas Mann, Charles Bukowski and Franz Kafka. The author, Knut Hamsun, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1920 for his monumental work, Growth of the Soil. It is hunger, however, that he is most known for, and that, astonishingly, is the author's first novel. It is the story of a young, starving artist wandering the streets of Christiania, nowadays Oslo, in 19th century Norway. And since I am starting my Norwegian lessons next week, I thought I would celebrate with talking about how to best approach this book and how to get the most out of your reading experience. So we'll talk about translation, pace, what to look out for, and the likes. So my first tip is to let this book get you out of a reading slump. This book is often called the little brother of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because the feelings of paranoia, claustrophobia, and even bordering psychosis are so intense. However, Hunger is a lot more fast-paced, and our narrator's world is descending into chaos so quickly that this book is truly the savior for the impatient reader. Tip number 2 has to do with translation. So there are 4 different translations into English available of Hunger. And after doing a lot of research and cross-comparing with the original Norwegian, I still like the Sverre Lyngstad translation the best. This is the one I have here right in front of me. To me, this translation feels immediate and urgent, and there's just not a lot of fluff. And even though I can't speak Norwegian yet, I can understand it a little bit, and to me it is most close to the original. However, there is another translation available that you might like by Egerton, and I'm just going to read you the first couple of sentences from both the Egerton and the Lyngstad translation, so you can decide for yourself. I'll start with Egerton. It was during the time I wandered about and starved in Christiania. Christiania, this singular city from which no man departs without carrying away the traces of his sojourn there. I was lying awake in my attic, and I heard a clock below strike 6. It was already broad daylight, and people had begun to go up and down the stairs. By the door where the wall of the room was papered with old numbers of the Morgenbladet, I could distinguish clearly a notice from the director of lighthouses, and a little to the left of that, an inflated advertisement of Fabian Olsen's new-baked bread. Moving on to Lyngstad. It was in those days when I wandered about hungry in Christiania, that strange city which no one leaves before it has set its mark upon him. Lying awake in my attic room, I hear a clock strike 6 downstairs. It was fairly light already, and people were beginning to walk up and down the stairs. Over by the door, where my room was papered with old issues of Morgenbladet, I could see, very clearly, a notice from the director of lighthouses, and just left of it, a fat, swelling ad for freshly baked bread by Fabian Olsen, baker. So the Egerton translation is also, I saw on YouTube in form of an audiobook, so you can also check that out if you're more interested in that one. I'll try to put a link to that in the description below. I'm just quickly going to touch on the 2 other translations into English. There's the Terence Cave translation that is apparently available in Oxford World Classics, but I found that really difficult to come by. And then there's the Robert Bly translation that is compared in the back of this book. They sort of cross-compare sections, and I just didn't like it as much. Again, this translation to me really shows the pleasure of simple and direct writing. So all the quotes I'm going to read further on in this video are also going to come from this edition. Tip number 3 is to notice the revolutionary writing. So Knut Hamsun was born in Norway in 1859, and Hunger was published in 1890. And it is considered to be the first Norwegian modern novel. As Paul Auster writes in the afterword of this edition, by 19th century standards, it is a work in which nothing happens. So Knut Hamsun, being the master of sort of a stream of consciousness writing and this continuous inner monologue, was completely new back then. And it is a style of writing that we take for granted nowadays. And that is the hallmark of so many modernist novels. James Joyce and Marcel Proust have really taken this approach of inner monologue and stream of consciousness to the extreme. But back then it was revolutionary. And to me it is hilarious. As I said, it feels so fast-paced. It feels like a lot is happening. And to think that readers back then, to those standards, nothing much happens in this book, it's just really lovely to connect to that. Tip number 4 is to keep an eye out for the different kinds of hunger. So this book is about a man who's hungry, yes, and there are vivid descriptions of that all throughout the book. Page 19. I had noticed distinctly that every time I went hungry for quite a long time, it was as though my brain trickled quietly out of my head, leaving me empty. Page 49. Here I was walking around so hungry that my intestines were squirming inside me like snakes. But he is not only physically hungry, he's starving for different things as well. Love, recognition, fulfillment, and I think ultimately creativity. And there's this proverb that says that man shall not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. And I think that is so true for our protagonist here. He's not religious, so he's not living for the word of God. But I think for artists, very often our God is creativity, and he is living for inspiration, for expressing himself, for not dumbing down his ideas, for being true to himself. His God, I think, is inspiration and novelty. Okay, tip number 5 is to read this book fast. So this book is sectioned into 4 parts. They're all about equal length. They're like 50 pages long, one part. And I would implore you as best as you can to just read each of these parts through in one go. So 50 pages one day, 50 pages the next. That's very doable. It's not difficult writing at all. Also, the pages aren't very full or anything. But this approach really helps to live inside the mania of this man. And it makes you feel the fever that makes this book so attractive. I'm going to be honest, it was hard for me to read all the sections back to back. So I spread it out over 4 different weekends. And I read 50 pages on a weekend day for 4 weeks in a row. But it was still good to sort of do it all in one go, to do a section in one go. I think it wouldn't have the same intense effect if you just read 5 pages and then you put the book down again. Tip number 6 is to confront yourself with hunger, coldness, and poverty. So think about this. When was the last time you were truly hungry? When was the last time you were cold for a prolonged period of time? Or were you ever in a situation where you couldn't come home to a warm, comfortable apartment or house? So when I read this book, I took a lot of long walks in the cold, and this combination really gave me a new appreciation for the things I tend to take for granted, like food and shelter and warmth. I mean, the man in our novel is eating wood chips because he's hungry. He's biting his own finger. He really is in a dire situation. And I think the value of this book is to observe how you react to that. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you're in a situation well enough off where you don't have to hunger for food. and you have a roof over your head. And you're not used to prolonged exposure to hunger and poverty. You know, when we see a person on the street begging for money, I personally always find that a little uncomfortable. I don't know exactly how to react, but it's over within 2 seconds because you're just walking past. The value of this book is that you're living inside the mind of someone who's living on the street, basically, for hours and hours and hours on end, and you can't escape it. And to observe what happens inside of you is just very valuable. For me, it was really difficult and very confronting in the beginning. And at a certain point, I sort of just hardened. I got used to it. And I think that's what happens so often in life. And then the most worthwhile question to ask, I think as well, is why doesn't he accept help? He literally turns down money from other people. Is it because he's an idealist? Is it because he's stupid, mentally ill? Is it pride, self-punishment, compulsion? And he's not alone in that. I used to have a friend who works at a homeless shelter, and he said that the system in Austria is really good, and if you can accept help, you're basically not gonna end up on the street. The problem, however, is that there are people who just don't want help, or they don't accept help. And that is actually the real, well, not the real problem, but like that's what needs to be looked at and taken into consideration. So tip number 7 is to connect to the starving artist inside of you. You know, so many of us dream of making a living from the art we create, whether that's writing or music or pottery or painting or whatever it is that you do. And it's scary to pursue because often good art doesn't immediately bring in a lot of money. So we're scared to make the leap. We're scared of making mistakes, scared of making a hobby into something that needs to be performed. And what happens is that so many people never take the step. I would say the grand majority of people who have ever dreamed of doing that are too scared to even take the step. And the thing about fear is that it always comes connected to pictures, strangely. And when I think my own fear all the way to the end, the picture that comes to mind is that I'm living on the streets because I have decided against a secure and stable job, and I've pursued my passion instead. And strangely, this book feels like the exteriorized version of my fear. And I think I'm not alone in that. It made me live in my own scared brain for the duration of reading this book. I literally wrote down here, I feel like if I would write down everything that's in my brain, this book would come out. I mean, everything that's in my scared brain. And weirdly, even though this book is hard and extreme and confronting and tragic, it, in a strange way, it gave me hope. Because here we have someone who lives on the other extreme of being scared. He's a person who doesn't give up, who's not even really afraid, I feel like. And it strangely had a little bit of a cathartic effect on me. It feels like I confronted myself with that situation so much that I don't have to be scared of it anymore. And you know, you can call him stupid or naive. To my inner state, it was very balancing, that view. I really appreciated it. You know, he's a true idealist, and he doesn't want to dumb down his art, but also his heart, maybe. And Paul Auster also said about this book that, quote, "Something new is happening here. Some new thought about the nature of art is being proposed in Hunger. An art that is indistinguishable from the life of the artist who makes it. An art that is the direct expression of the effort to express itself." Tip number 8 is to consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So many of you will know the hierarchy of needs. I'll put a picture up on the screen. But in a nutshell, this hierarchy proposes that Only if the lower, more basic needs like food and shelter are covered does one care about esteem, self-actualizations, and all the other needs that are higher on the pyramid. Now, this book seriously makes me question that. It almost seems like it's throwing Maslow's pyramid of needs upside down, and I personally love it when a book does that, because I used to read a lot of self-help books. I also have, I think, a couple of books by Abraham Maslow, and everything always seems so straightforward. Everything always fits into a theory, into a model. It all seems very easy, but then life is different, and this book is showing that, and I love that. I mean, just listen to this. How wonderful to be an honest person again. My empty pockets no longer felt heavy. It was a pleasure to be broke once more. All things considered, I had to admit that this money had cost me much secret anguish. I thought of it with a veritable shudder, time and time again. Tip number 9 is a suggestion for a complimentary read, namely A Hunger Artist by Franz Kafka. I think this is wonderful because not only was Franz Kafka influenced by Knut Hamsun, his short story, A Hunger Artist, also deals with many of the same themes. It is about a man whose art is starvation, because he just can't find anything to eat that he likes. He can't find nourishment that he could accept. And tip number 10 would be to journal or think about this one question throughout reading the book, namely, what makes someone poor? That to me is the question at the heart of this novel, and I'm very curious to hear what you come up with. I'll leave you with this quote by Knut Hamsun himself, where he says, "Do not forget, some give little, and it is much for them. Others give all, and it costs them no effort. Who then has given most?" So let me know your thoughts on this book. Let me know whether you've read it, whether you've enjoyed it, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye bye.